We've talked about doing validation server-side. We're going to talk about how to do validation client-side and why you would even do it twice on both sides. But before we can even talk about doing that client-side, we need to talk about how the browser deals with a web page, and in particular, what is the DOM, the Document Object Model? Well, there I just answered my own question, didn't I? You know what the DOM is. You write a web page, you write HTML. That HTML, if you think about it, is really a data structure. Can you pause and think about what your favorite data structure, or one of your favorite data structures from CS2 is that HTML really represents? I mean, I know it's a string. Technically, the HTML is just a big string. But you put in those tags. What are those tags really doing? They're like parentheses that are really giving you a tree structure. You have a HTML node at the top, and that has a head and a body node. And then under the body node, you go ahead and have, maybe a H1 tag and a P tag and another P tag and an ordered list tag and so on, and things under that. And you get a big, huge tree of structure. That's the markup language that says, hey, let's mark up a plain flat string with extra tags that are going to be interpreted as a tree structure. Great. So your browser is sent a bunch of HTML. It's going to go and grab that flat string, and it's going to create the tree. And it's going to actually create a class. There's going to be a class tree, and it's going to actually make an object of class tree. And that tree will be in memory. That's what the DOM is. That tree structure in living memory. Okay. And the reason we're talking about that is, hey, once we have a tree structure, then we can go ahead and change it. I mean, my browser can't really change the HTML off in a file that was written somewhere else on some server, but it can go ahead and change the tree that it's representing. And once we know to have code to change the DOM, then we can go ahead and do things like client-side validation or whatever. So, before we get into JavaScript and how JavaScript interacts with the DOM, let's just go and look at what the DOM is. So first of all, when we start doing client-side activity with our browser and writing client-side code, don't try writing client-side browser code without a good debugger and developer tools, which are built into most modern browsers. So if you go to Google Chrome and go to More Tools, and maybe it's a little bit hard to see off the screen here, but there is a Developer Tools. There's a shortcut for it. On the Mac, it's Option-Command-I. I recommend memorizing that. It's nice to be able to just pull this up all the time. And in here, we see a bunch of different things. This is, again, Chrome's browser tools as of spring of 2020. The details will change, but we can go ahead and I'm looking at the elements notion here, and we can actually see it's actually kind of nice. As I mouse over this, I can actually see parts of my page get highlighted. There's a lot of good information here. Let's just take a moment looking at this information. Yeah, I can mouse over this and I can see, hey, what actually on the web page corresponds to, oh, it's this H1 tag. And I can see it. It actually shows me both the H1 text itself and the box that surrounds it and the padding. And if you really want to go and look at, and there's different ways of showing you in this, I recommend looking at a lot of these different things here. So clicking on different things, see what you get. For instance, it will show you all the paddings and margins and borders. So if you're really getting to the nitty-gritty of CSS layout, yeah, this is a pretty essential tool to see what's going on if it doesn't look like what you think it should. Fortunately, that was all Web 1. We're not going to worry about that CSS stuff. But we are going to look at the DOM here. If you look at this, actually it's a tree structure, and you can see that's actually a tree structure because we have all these drop-down arrows, which are a collapsed node of the tree. And if you tilt your head sideways far enough, you can see that, oh yeah, this does look like a tree from the top down, and I can expand out the subnodes and the subnodes and the sub-sub-subnodes. So, great, so we can go ahead and look at that. The other thing I want to So I'm going to go and, sure, we can look at that H1 here. I'll select it down here. Now, down here I see a bunch of things, including styles, computed, event listeners, properties. I'm going to look at the properties, okay? So again, we have a tree. This is a tree object. Every tree node has fields. Like it might have a list of children, and it might have the contents of that node itself, the H1 tag, and so on. Well, that's a simplification. If you actually look at all the types of objects that are in there, this H1 here is an H1 object that inherits from an HTML heading element, that inherits from HTML element, that inherits from element, and so on, all the way up to object. Great. So, wow, that's just the hierarchy, the inheritance hierarchy of an H1 tag. Let's go and look at some of the actual fields that an H1 tag is. Now I'm going to guess, based on this HTML that I see here, I'm going to guess what fields are involved with this thing. I'm going to guess that there's the case study refactoring JavaScript. That string is going to be one of the fields, I'm going to bet. And I'll bet this align equals center. I'll bet that shows up as a field somewhere. So let's go and actually look at the fields. And I'm going to look at this H1. Hey, align, center. Yeah, hey, that's one of the fields inside the H1. Title, empty string. Lang, empty string. Translate, true. Dir, hidden key, access key, output mode, style, inner text, outer text, on copy. Oh my goodness, there are lots and lots of different attributes. And if you want to be a web developer, part of being a web developer is knowing, hey, what are the attributes? What things are in that tree structure so that I can go and modify and change them as I desire. So we're not going to get too nitty-gritty on this, not very much at all. But I will note that, hey, we had H1, we had align equals center, and sure enough, that attribute, we called this an attribute back in HTML, right? Every tag has attributes and the attribute value. The attributes are key value pairs. Well, you know, that word attribute would be used in object-oriented programming as well, right? Objects have attributes and values, or fields and their values. And so sure enough, the HTML attribute becomes an object attribute, okay? And that's why they use those same terms. But there's a lot more attributes than appeared back in the HTML. Wow, there's a whole lot more that I can see. Align equals center is the only one I've mentioned, but there's a whole bunch of other ones as well. Okay, so that's good to know that we actually have the tree there, and we can look at all these different attributes. Any ones that really stand out to me, we are going to use. So we'll come back to that style attribute. There's inner text, okay? Notice that the inner text is, that's the case study refactoring JavaScript, okay? There's also an outer text. I don't quite even know the difference between those. I'd have to Google that or buy one of those HTML for dummies. Well, this would be the DOM for dummies, the JavaScript's fields for the tree object and the node object of that tree. Okay, on copy, on cut, on change. We're going to be using things like on change and on click later for our JavaScript events. Those values will actually be function values if they have a value. Anything else? Gosh, there's a lot of those on. Nots. Enter a key hint. Okay. Yeah, I don't. Oh, ID. ID is kind of interesting. If I do take something that does have an ID, I'm going to scroll down a little bit here. I'm going to get to this. Not only can I mouse over down here and see what gets highlighted. There we are. And try to find something by mousing over the elements and seeing what gets highlighted up on the screen. Chrome has this neat little thing, this little cursor in a box. Click on that. Go and click on the thing on your web page that you care about, and it will bring you right to the part of the DOM, the part of the tree that is representing that. So here we go ahead, and I have a little, it's an input box here, a little text box, input that includes ID equals sample. And so sure enough, so it actually names this over here, it's an input hash sample. That's using CSS notation. But if we go and look at the ID attribute of this, Scroll down, where is it? Somewhere. Finding these is not as easy as one might like. But go through all the attributes of this particular text input, and here we have ID sample. So that's an attribute value that we've seen before that we know about. Okay, great. I will point out a few other things. I put in, there's some various things, ID laying equals en, that's shown there. On change, we could see that here as style. We could go ahead and see that. Text and value, we saw those when we talked about input HTML tags. I did put one more input called blah, which is, well, that is interesting. And the reason I did that is I was doing an experiment myself. I'm like, hey, I wonder if I put in, I'm going to make up something that's not an actual HTML official attribute for input tags, but gosh, for all I know, that could get carried over and put into the DOM, and there could be a field called blah that has that value in JavaScript. We'll see in a second, JavaScript lets you add attributes willy-nilly. And the answer is, it is not. I scrolled through here, I looked all around, there was no blah with a value. Well, that is interesting. So things that are not legal HTML attributes don't actually get carried over and put into the DOM. There are things in the DOM that aren't HTML attributes that the browser added, but I can't necessarily engineer those just by making up things that aren't HTML and putting them in my HTML. That's a little side note that you might have wondered about. Okay. So we have this input whose ID is sample. Let's go to the console window. And by the way, if we look at my console window, this is the JavaScript console. And if we ever run JavaScript, it's a very important thing to be aware of. And actually, if you look at it, there's a whole bunch of errors here, a whole slew of it. Failed to load resource, failed to load resource, failed to load resource. What are these different resources getting failed? Google.g.doubleclick.pageadd. Oh, and so it failed to load that resource. Why? Net error blocked by client. Oh, can you guess what's doing that? Yeah, that's my ad blocker. Okay, so the JavaScript is trying to request different files. The ad blocker is blocking that, and so it shows up as an error in the JavaScript window. It's not a fatal error. The code keeps on running, but it lets you know that, hey, certain things certain things didn't add. I'm also getting some things about a cookie associated with a cross-site reference. YouTube was set without the same site attribute. It has been blocked as Chrome now only blah, blah, blah. Okay, so Chrome is giving some little warning messages. And they're put out on the console window of the JavaScript. Okay, so, okay. This JavaScript console, you can type in anything that's valid JavaScript, like 2 plus 3, and get things. If you go ahead and make a variable, var x gets hello, you can certainly do that. And x has the value hello. It turns out there is one global variable that is provided to the JavaScript that the browser is running. Or put it this way, your JavaScript will be run by the browser, and the browser is going to make one global variable and give it to you. And that one global variable is called document. Okay? And here we have an object of type document. And if we look inside there, we see, gosh, all that stuff. Okay? So this is a document is a global variable, and so it's made up by the browser so that you can write code that can get the information from the browser. The browser will gives you access to that object. There's one really important method in document that we can call get element by ID. Okay, and you pass it a string. I'll pass it the string sample, and it comes back and gives me out of the entire tree. It goes inside and grabs the one node that I'm concerned with. Hey, that's a good reason. That's why we gave something an ID attribute, so that, hey, we could later talk about, hey, that one node of the entire tree. So document.getElementById is a method on the document object, and you call it, and you get back one particular node of that tree. Okay. So, okay. Fair enough, we have this input node. I can go ahead and do things like say, hey, what is document.getElementById of sample.value? Okay, and it gives me the value of that thing. And I can go and ask for any of the other fields. I can say, hey, what is your ID field? Well, we hopefully know that one. What is your style field? And we get a, gosh, it turns out the style attribute inside, so there's all these, you have a tree, the DOM, has all these attributes like ID. The style is an attribute. What is the associated, what's associated with that attribute? An entire, well, it's an entire hash table, it looks like. A whole nother dictionary, a whole nother set of key value pairs is associated with the key style. So, okay. So I can actually go and do things. I could go and I can also look up the name attribute since an input we have. I didn't give that that box a name attribute. Okay. Take the style attribute. Here's one thing I can do. I can take that style attribute and set one of the. So the style attribute is another object, a whole object with its own fields, like border top style, border right style, and a whole bunch of them, ... Yeah, and I can go ahead, I'm going to go and change the color is one of the easiest ones to change. Color equal red, the string red. And so, okay, I do that, this returns the value red. Look what happened in my browser. That turned from orange to red. Maybe it was a little bit hard to see. Let's go ahead and change it from red to what's a different color that's a little bit nicer. Yellow? Yeah, it'll be hard to see. Yeah. Looks like it's there. If you look really closely and zoom in on your screen, you can actually see that. So set it to be black. Okay. Yeah, so this now you can see, hey, can I have JavaScript code that can actually change a web page? You go and you have the actual tree, and you can get a node of that tree, and you can actually assign to its fields, and those fields affect how that tree is being displayed. I guess if you're really thinking about it, the browser probably has, we're using the listener pattern. It's probably listening for changes to this object, and if any of the fields of this object's change, the browser is alerted to that, says, quick, go redraw my web page. So, but we don't really need to worry about that. It just happens magically. We set that field of the tree and boom, the pixels rendered on my screen change at the same time. So that's nice. Okay, so that's the DOM, and that's how we can get access to it. I put a lot more into this one video than I thought I was going to. I'm going to make 4 5-minute videos, but now I have one video that's probably hitting 20 minutes here. Sorry about that. Let me just go ahead and mention a few weird things. I said that key value pairs, attributes that are in the HTML, turn into attributes that are in the DOM. Okay, and then the DOM has a whole lot more other attributes as well. Let me just point out a few weirdnesses or inconsistencies. Every HTML attribute turns into a JavaScript attribute, but okay, hyphenated style attributes turn into camel case. So for instance, inside the style, we might have style border width is 2 pixels. If we're looking at the DOM, we can go into get attribute by ID and grab its style object. And the style object, we can look up, we don't look up the field border hyphen width. Why hyphen in JavaScript would mean subtract. You can't have a hyphen as part of a name. So it was a part of the name in the CSS attribute, but inside the JavaScript we can't use a hyphen, so it's not going to be exactly the same name. Just be aware of that little difference. Okay. I mentioned before, if you provide an invalid node attribute in the HTML, it doesn't get attached to the DOM. Okay. Oh, sorry, point B on this first one. There's one attribute that changes its name entirely, not just a camel case different. In HTML, you have class. Okay, you can have paragraph class equal important or whatever. Well, in JavaScript, class is a reserved word. You can't have a field whose name is class. I'm guessing that's the reason why. All I know is that when I look at it, what I had in my HTML as class shows up in the DOM. There's an attribute that's not called class, it's called class name. Okay, so just be aware of that. That's one where we actually use that attribute both in the HTML and in the DOM. If you want to change the class of a paragraph on the fly by using JavaScript, don't assign to the .class field, assign to the .class name field. Okay. What else do I have? A little note about HTML Boolean attributes. Okay, so I think we talked about this before. There are Boolean attributes like a checkbox being checked or a menu item being selected. There is an attribute we can in the HTML we can say something like the attribute checked has the value checked. We don't say checked equal true or checked equal false. We say checked equal checked, or we don't include it at all. Okay. In the DOM, it does what you want. In the DOM, we'll have an attribute called checked, and it's a Boolean attribute. It either has the value true or false. Okay. So, in fact, we can even try. I'm going to go ahead and run, copy and paste this here. By reverse engineering what I'm typing, can you see what's going on? Document, get element by ID of CB. Oh, I'm claiming that's this little checkbox here. And look at the check status, true. I'm going to click this box on my web page and now ask the JavaScript and see that it's false. And I can even go and assign it to be true. And when I do this, let's see if it actually magically suddenly gets checked up here. Yes. Okay. So great. So Boolean attributes that we have to mangle in HTML, if we don't say true or false, we say checked equal checked, or we don't mention it at all. In the DOM, it's actually a Boolean, just like you'd expect. I have a little note here about the attribute content editable. It's not always so simple. Things get confusing. Content editable is an HTML tag, HTML attribute. And its values can be true or false or the empty string, at least in HTML5. Or it can be no value at all, okay, which we won't allow for this class, but that can be done. If you go ahead and just treat it as if it were Boolean, it's going to be a little bit iffy, because if you give it the value false, the string F-A-L-S-E as a string attribute value, that's not the Boolean false, that's a string. And string, non-empty strings are true in JavaScript, true-ish. So yeah, be careful about weird things like that. We're not going to worry about it in this class. I'm going to let people who are actual professional web developers worry about remembering all these weird little things that are a little bit different and unexpected. Okay, so, and then finally I'm going to go ahead and look at, suppose we had this for our HTML source, okay? But span, ID text with entities, and then I go ahead and for the body of the span I have ampersand LT semicolon. We know that's the entity for a less than. Here, oops, LT, the word here, and GT, okay? Well, when you go to the DOM and actually look for that, hey, what is the body of that tag? Okay, grab the text out of there, the inner text, I think it was called. You might say, hey, I'm going to get a string with 12 characters in it. Okay. The first character being ampersand. I reloaded by mistake there. I have a typo. That first greater than shouldn't be there. It's not in the page source that will be there. I'll fix that in a moment online. You might say it's 12 characters. The ampersand LT semicolon, HERE, ampersand GT semicolon. 12 characters. That's the body of the tag. That's what was in my HTML. It turns out it's 6 characters. When JavaScript is building that tree, that's the moment. That is the moment where it sees an entity like ampersand LT semicolon and snarfs it in and converts it to the corresponding character. Okay? So in the DOM, by the time you reach the DOM, I don't think you have any entities anymore. They've all actually been turned into actual characters of text. So, okay. And I mentioned the notes here. For me, that's a little bit reminiscent of when you make a string in Java and you have a /n. You have to type 2 characters, but when Java constructs the actual string object in memory, there's only one a new line character there, not a / character and end character. Well, similarly, you have to type in ampersand LT semicolon, but when it actually gets constructed in memory, it's down to an actual less than character. So, okay. So, whew. That's a lot of little things there. We'll talk more about some of these attributes, and we'll see some code and start using them next. Thanks. And goodbye.